In Module 7, we got a whirlwind tour of 4 common research approaches in health sciences. In Module 8, we will focus on just 2 approaches, cohort studies and experimental studies. We will devote more time to each of these because they are more complex than the previously discussed approaches. They are also 2 of the most powerful study types, as you will see. First up, cohort studies. So cohort or prospective longitudinal studies follow participants through time to identify risk factors for the disease. In other words, cohort studies recruit and assess a bunch of participants who are healthy, and then keep up with them regularly over time to see who eventually develops the disease. Then they can retrace their steps to the beginning of the study and see what characteristics these participants had that may have contributed to their eventual diagnosis. The primary study questions are, what are the potential risk factors or exposures for a disease? Are these exposures associated with an increased incidence of disease? So for example, is high cholesterol a risk factor for eventually developing Alzheimer's disease? The approach is used when researchers want to determine long-term effects of certain exposures or want to discover new potential exposures for diseases. Ideally, a cohort study would examine multiple exposures and multiple outcomes. In this approach, participants must start out relatively healthy, or at least not have the diseases of interest. They must also be available for follow-up months or years after they're enrolled in the study. Also, it's important to know that cohort studies are a lot of work and they cost a fortune. So if you can convince someone to fund your study, it means that your study probably has huge importance for public health knowledge. It also means that you already have some well-founded hypotheses about exposure-disease relationships based on previous research conducted using other approaches, say using case series, ecological studies, case control studies, etc. Therefore, to justify doing a longitudinal study, your literature search has to be quite extensive. Prospective longitudinal studies follow a group of individuals forward in time. At the time of recruitment, the goal is to enroll a large group of individuals that are fairly representative of the general population, or your target population. You don't have to recruit individuals who already have the disease of interest. In fact, participants should not have that disease at the beginning of the study, since the point is to follow them forward in time to see who develops the disease and who does not. This allows us to assess exposures without knowing the outcome, that is, without bias. So depending on how common the disease of interest is, some portion of participants in your cohort will eventually develop the disease and some will not. And you will be able to compare the exposure histories, which you measured at each step of the way between these two groups, and thereby identify risk factors for the disease. An important decision to make about longitudinal study designs is how often data collection will take place and how long the study will last. This will largely depend on human and financial resources for the research project. Another consideration is that attrition, also known as participant dropout, is quite common. Longitudinal studies tend to last years, and inevitably, some participants will move, change their contact information, or cease to be interested in participating. Therefore, you should recruit more participants than you think you need, as well as develop strategies for keeping them in your study. So, for example, offering incentives for completing each follow-up and trying to form long-term ongoing relationships with the participants. In terms of measurement, it is important to anticipate what types of information you will want to examine years from now, since you will not be able to go back in time and add new measures. Researchers often create very comprehensive assessment batteries that include information that may not seem relevant at this time. In this way, the Framingham researchers have been able to test many new and creative hypotheses using the huge datasets they have gathered over the years. To get a peek into the Framingham studies and to better understand cohort studies generally, you will read an article by Zaldi and colleagues in this module.